How's it going, my bakers? Hope you're having a great day. Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to try and make a yeast dough bread look, taste, feel and smell like sourdough bread. So let's go to the kitchen and see what it takes. Since my channel has become the home of bread making comparison videos, I thought it would be quite interesting to see the differences between a bread made with a commercial yeast pre-ferment versus a sourdough pre-ferment. Same amount of ingredients, same temperatures, same exact fermentation times. Perhaps it is possible to replicate sourdough bread using yeast. The pre-ferment that we're going to use is a Bega. It is a stiff pre-ferment at only 50% hydration. I chose this because it's summertime right now, it's quite hot in my kitchen, and a low hydration pre-ferment ferments more slowly. The amount of flour and water in the sourdough one is adjusted to account for the amount of flour and water in the starter, and the yeast Bega only contains 1/10 of a gram of yeast. I want to try and match the fermentation times of the yeasted one with the sourdough one. So that is all the yeast that we're going to use in this recipe. If you want these recipes, they will be written in the link below the video. Of course, this is not a recipe video, this is a comparison video. So I'm not going to be talking about too much of the steps here, but we'll talk about the differences between yeast and sourdough. And before anyone says, no Charlie, you can't compare these, sourdough is sourdough, it's way different from yeast. What I will say, this is not about the health benefits. All I'm trying to do here is make the yeasted dough taste, smell and feel like sourdough bread. And I've never compared this side by side. Of course, we all know that sourdough bread is more crusty, it has a different aroma, a different mouthfeel and a way different flavor. But most of that comes from the long fermentation time. So if we treat the yeast dough the same way, maybe we'll get some similar results. The yeast Bega is still on the left, of course, it did ferment more rapidly. That's totally fine, it just gave it another chance to build some more flavor. The main difference with the sourdough starter is that it does not only contain yeast, it also contains bacteria. And that's what gives the flavor difference, that sourness. But using a pre-fermented yeast dough and then not adding any more yeast to it on the next day and fermenting it for a long time may just build enough flavor to replicate that. See, normally when I use a yeast pre-ferment, on the following day, usually I would be adding more yeast at this stage. The way I see it, the pre-ferment has been fermenting for several hours, it's built some flavor, we're going to add it to the main dough, we don't need to ferment it for that long anymore. And it's true, the addition of a pre-ferment in the regular bread makes a huge difference in flavor and texture. But recently, I made an Italian bread, pane sciocco. Now it doesn't contain any salt, and that's the reason for using a very tiny amount of yeast. Since there is no salt slowing down fermentation, only a little bit of yeast is needed. So in that recipe, the formula was similar to this. There was only a tiny amount of yeast in the pre-ferment, which was also bigger, and then on the next day, there was no more yeast added. Of course, in the recipes in this video, there is salt, but that gives us another advantage. The salt will be slowing down fermentation, so that means that the yeast dough can be fermented for even longer. The other video inspired this video is what I'm trying to say. Another thing I did here to really slow things down is make the doughs quite cool. As you can see here, it's just below 23 degrees Celsius, which is about 73 degrees Fahrenheit, which is quite cool for a dough. Saying that, my kitchen is quite warm at around 25 degrees Celsius or 77 Fahrenheit. The bulk fermentation of these will take 6 hours, with one fold halfway through. I'm curious if any one of you has ever tried this. I'm sure most of us have tried a bread made with a sourdough leaven and another one made with a yeast leaven. But of course, most of the time the yeasted ones fermented for less time. So let me know down in the comments if you ever tried something like this. Taste is highly subjective after all. Mine and your results may vary. And by the way, if you are new here, I would highly suggest checking out the Principles of Baking playlist. I have made quite a few comparison videos like this, using different ingredients and different methods. The results are sometimes quite surprising and interesting. Okay, now back to our breads for a second. They have been fermenting for 3 hours, I gave them a fold, now I cover them up and I'll leave them for another 3 hours fermentation. That's the bulk fermentation done. And straight after the bulk fermentation, I'm doing the final shaping. This is quite a unique bread, it's called pan rustique. It's kind of like a giant ciabatta. So instead of shaping it by folding it into a certain shape, it simply gets trimmed around the edges. So I will talk you through the steps here, because it's quite interesting and unique. Drop the dough out with the smooth side down on a floured surface. Use plenty of flour, or it will stick. Then dust the bottom of it with more flour. This is a 70% hydration dough, and it's made with pre-ferment, so it's a little bit sticky. Now using the scraper, trim it down to a rectangle shape. Now grab a piece of baking paper. Those trimmings will of course not go to waste. They will form the bottom of the loaf. So you want to arrange them on the paper so that they kind of match the footprint of the larger piece of dough. Don't worry about making it perfect, as long as there's no dough sticking out. Now flip the main piece of dough upside down, so that's the smooth side up again, and place it nice and square on those trimmings. And that's ready for the final fermentation. It's a pretty cool technique, right? Now I'm just going to repeat it with the sourdough version, and then we can move on to final proofing, baking, and testing the differences between them. So far, I can say that the two doughs are quite similar. The sourdough one is a little bit looser and stretchier, and is fermenting more slowly. Of course, the slower fermentation is one of the reasons why it's looser and stretchier. There's not that much gas buildup inside it, so obviously the yeasted one will be going in the oven first. But that's fine, by the time it's finished baking, we can bake the other one. My oven's not large enough to accommodate both these at the same time anyway. It's funny that even with such a tiny amount of yeast, it's still fermenting more rapidly than the sourdough one. I could have easily used half of what I did. Right, before this one goes in the oven, let me just tell you what I'm doing here. You can see me dusting the loaf with flour. That's to make the surface nice and uniform. You can also see me using the scraper. I like to push the sides in to make it nice and square. It's a simple step, but it makes all the difference. But enough of that. Finally, here's what we came to see. Commercial yeast on the left, sourdough on the right. Leave these to cool down. And well, looking at them from the top, I mean they're pretty similar, right? The color is exactly the same. Yes, the yeasted one has gained a little bit more volume. Perhaps my starter is a little bit sluggish. But looking at them, handling them, pressing them, they feel exactly the same. Slicing them also feels the same. And that gives a good idea on what the texture will be like. A slow fermented dough like this has that tough kind of chewy texture. And of course I mean that in a good way. It is still soft, but it's nice and sturdy. But there's only so much you can tell whilst cutting the bread. Let's give them a good squeeze, a smell, and a taste. But first let's look at the crumb. It looks pretty much identical. Same color, same random bubbles. The softness is also the same. One thing I should have done is score these loaves. Right, smelling them, the sourdough one does have that distinct sour smell. The yeast one also smells nice and intense, it has that strong wheaty aroma. But the sourdough one does smell a little bit more sour, but let's give them a taste. I'll start with the yeasted one. That'll give me a better idea on how different they are. It has a very nice fermented flavor, that intense kind of wheaty taste. If you gave this to me on its own and told me that it's a sourdough bread, I would believe you. But I can say that taking the bite out of the sourdough one does show one distinct difference. There is that slightly more intense sourness, that acidity, but it's not that much more intense than the yeast one. I'm sure I can mostly just tell the difference because I'm comparing them side by side. If the yeast bread was on its own, it could pass as a sourdough loaf, no doubt. But then again, taste is highly subjective, so you're gonna have to find out for yourself. So what do you think these results? Have you tried something like this before? Let me know down in the comments. If you want to see more videos like this one, click over here, subscribe to the channel, click right here. But that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.